At 9:17 on January 22, 1943, Second Lieutenant John George crouched inside the ruins of a captured Japanese bunker west of Point Cruz, watching a banyan tree 240 yards away through a scope his fellow officers had mocked for weeks. He was 27 and Illinois state shooting champion and had yet to fire a single shot in combat. Japanese snipers had been terrorizing the area around Point Cruz. 11 of them operated in the groves, and in just 3 days they had killed 14 men of the 132nd Infantry. George's commanding officer had dismissed his rifle as a toy, and other platoon leaders joked it was his mail-order sweetheart. When George unpacked his Winchester Model 70 with a Lyman Alaskan scope in Tennessee, even the armorer asked if he planned to hunt deer or Germans. He explained it was meant for the Japanese, but when his unit shipped out, the rifle hadn't arrived. During the voyage to Guadalcanal, he watched other soldiers clean their garons while his own rifle sat in a warehouse back home. He had it forwarded through military mail, and 6 weeks later, around Christmas 1942, a supply sergeant finally handed him a crate marked fragile. Inside was the rifle he had saved 2 years' pay to buy. George's bolt-action Winchester carried 5 rounds and weighed 9 pounds, plus another 12 ounces for the scope. Everyone else in his battalion carried semi-automatic garons with 8 rounds and no magnification. Captain Morris ordered George to leave the sporting rifle in his tent. He ignored the order. The 132nd Infantry relieved the Marines on Guadalcanal in late December. The Marines had held Henderson Field, but hadn't cleared Mount Austin or the groves west of the Matanaku. Mount Austin held 500 Japanese defenders in nearly 50 bunkers. George's battalion attacked on December 17th and fought for 16 brutal days, losing 34 men killed and 279 wounded before they finally secured the western slope on January 2nd. Through it all, George never fired his Winchester once. Point Cruz was different. No bunkers, no fixed positions, just Japanese snipers hidden in the towering banyan trees. On January 19th, one killed Corporal Davis at a creek. The next day, another killed 2 soldiers on patrol. On January 21st, 3 more men died, including one shot from a tree the patrol had passed twice. That night, the battalion commander summoned George. Snipers were killing men faster than malaria. He needed someone who could shoot, and he wanted to know if George's mail-order rifle actually worked. He explained he was the Illinois state champion at 1,000 yards, the youngest winner in state history. 6-inch groups at 600 yards with iron sights, and tight 5-shot groups at 300 yards with his Lyman Alaskan scope. He'd spent the night cleaning his rifle, checking the mounts, and loading .30-06 military rounds. At dawn, on January 22nd, he returned to the ruined bunker overlooking the coconut groves where Japanese snipers were known to hide. Mounting up to be 87 feet high, with trunks 8 feet thick, were perfect hiding spots for men trained to wait motionless all day. George brought no spotter, no radio operator, only his rifle, a canteen, and 60 rounds in stripper clips. The Lyman Alaskan offered only 2.5 magnification, but it was enough to catch small movements invisible to the naked eye. He scanned each tree carefully. The jungle was alive with noise, but he had learned to ignore everything except motion. At 9:17, he noticed a branch shift, no wind, just a subtle movement. Off 87 feet high, a faint shape emerged, a man positioned in a fork of branches, watching the trail his battalion used for supply runs. George adjusted 2 clicks for wind, steadied his breathing, and fired. The rifle cracked. The sniper tumbled 90 feet to the ground. He knew a second one had to be nearby. Japanese snipers work in pairs. George searched the surrounding trees slowly. At 9:43, he found the partner 60 yards north, halfway down a trunk, trying to retreat after hearing the shot. George led the moving target and fired. The sniper fell backward through the branches, his rifle clattering ahead of him. 2 shots, 2 kills. George calmly reloaded, his hands steady. It felt like Camp Perry, except this time, the targets were shooting back.
At 11:21, a Japanese round slammed into a sandbag only 6 inches from George's head.
spraying dirt across his face. He rolled aside and pressed against the bunker wall, waiting several minutes before daring to move. The shot had come from the southwest, different from the previous snipers. When he finally eased back into position and scanned the trees, he knew the shooter had likely relocated. In such dense jungle, however, options were limited. At 11:38, he found him, third tree from the left in a cluster of 5 banyans, about 70 feet up. The sniper had stayed in the same tree but shifted to another branch, a fatal mistake. George fired, and the man dropped silently through the foliage. By noon, George had eliminated 5 Japanese snipers. Word spread quickly through the battalion. Men who once mocked his mail-order rifle now wanted to watch him work, but George refused. Extra eyes meant movement, and movement meant death. The Japanese adapted after the 5th kill. They stopped shifting positions during daylight, making them nearly invisible. George spent the afternoon scanning the groves, but saw nothing. At 1600, he returned to headquarters where Captain Morris, now without any hint of mockery, ordered him back at dawn. January 23rd began with heavy tropical rain. The jungle blurred into a wall of gray, making visibility impossible beyond 100 yards. George waited in the bunker until the storm eased. By 8:45, he could work again. At 9:12, he spotted his next target, cleverly climbing into position during the rain when noise masked movement. This sniper had chosen a tree nearly 300 yards away, farther than the others. They were learning. George adjusted for range and fired. The sniper fell. Kill number 6. Minutes later, something unexpected happened. At 11:57, Japanese mortars began hammering the area around the bunker. They had triangulated his position from the muzzle flash. The first rounds landed short. The second salvo was closer. The third would be a direct hit. George grabbed his rifle and sprinted north along the tree line, diving into a shell crater as explosions obliterated the bunker he had just abandoned. He shifted to a fallen tree 120 yards north and resumed watching the groves. More snipers came that afternoon. The Japanese now understood someone was hunting them, so they hunted him back. This had become a duel. At 1:42 p.m., he killed his 7th sniper. At 3:51 p.m., he shot his 8th, high in a banyan tree, silhouetted against the sky when the sun shifted. By 5 p.m., he'd been in position 9 hours. Captain Morris summoned him for a report. 8 confirmed kills in 2 days, 12 shots fired, 8 hits, 4 misses. Morris ordered him to continue operations the next morning. That night, George cleaned his Winchester and reviewed the situation. 11 Japanese snipers had been active in the groves. 8 were now dead. 3 remained, the most skilled, the most patient, the most dangerous, and they now knew exactly who he was and what rifle he carried. Rain returned at 4:15 a.m., delaying dawn operations. By 7 a.m., George moved to a new hiding place, a cluster of rocks 70 yards south of his previous position, once used as a Marine machine gun nest. It offered excellent cover and a wide view of the groves. He settled in as visibility improved. At 8:17 on January 24th, he spotted sniper number 9. The man had chosen a palm tree only 40 feet high, lower than usual, relying on the palm fronds for concealment. From ground level, he would have been invisible, but George's elevated rock position gave him a downward angle, revealing the outline of his shoulders and head. George aimed but hesitated. Something felt wrong. It was too obvious. After 3 days of dueling with professionals, he knew the remaining Japanese wouldn't make beginner's mistakes. This had to be a decoy. He lowered the rifle and scanned the area for the real threat. If the palm sniper was a decoy, the true shooter would be positioned to watch him take the shot, waiting for muzzle flash. After 11 minutes of methodical searching, he found the real sniper, 90 feet up a banyan tree 80 yards northwest. Perfect concealment. Clear line of sight to George's old position. He was waiting for George to appear at the fallen tree or to shoot at the decoy.
George had two problems. If he shot the real sniper directly, the sound would give away his new position, allowing the enemy to escape before he could work the bolt. But if he did nothing, the sniper would eventually realize George wasn't where expected. So, he used the bait against them. He aimed at the decoy in the palm tree, fired, and immediately shifted to the banyan. As predicted, the real sniper reacted to the shot, turning slightly toward the sound. That tiny movement was all George needed. He fired again. The sniper toppled from the tree, his rifle tumbling after him. 2 shots, 2 kills. But now his position was compromised. George grabbed his rifle and ammunition and sprinted east along the rocks, diving into a drainage ditch 40 yards away. Covered in mud, he waited in silence.
At 8:34, Japanese machine gun fire tore across the rocks where George had been positioned only seconds earlier, blasting dust and stone fragments into the air. The burst lasted nearly 20 seconds. When silence finally returned, he waited a full minute before crawling out and relocating, this time to a shell crater 100 yards east, half filled with rainwater. He slid into the muddy pool until the water reached his chest, set his Winchester on the rim, and resumed scanning the trees. He had 10 confirmed kills. Only one sniper remained, the best of the group, the most patient, the one who had watched his comrades die for 3 straight days. This last man knew George's patterns, his weapon, and roughly where he was operating. Somewhere out there, he was watching and waiting. George slowly searched the jungle through the Lyman Alaskan scope. Its modest magnification revealed shapes, but didn't identify them. Every shadow might be a branch or a rifle barrel. At 0947, he realized his mistake. The final sniper wasn't in the trees at all. He was on the ground, advancing toward George's previous position. Movement flickered at the edge of George's vision. 60 yards south, a low shape sliding through vines, ferns, and fallen branches. The sniper was crawling toward the rocks where George had taken cover under machine gun fire earlier. George stayed submerged, rifle ready, but the crater's rim blocked his angle. To shoot, he would have to rise up and expose himself. The Japanese sniper halted at 0952, about 40 yards from the rocks, studying the area for movement. George didn't move. Sniper work demanded patience above all else, the ability to wait, to let time pass, to strike only when the moment was right. At 0958, the sniper crept forward again, 35 yards, 30, 25. He was approaching from the south, the same route George had used when escaping the earlier attack. The sniper had watched the machine gun burst and was now tracking the most logical escape path. He was hunting George exactly as George had hunted him. At 10:03, the sniper reached the rocks and slipped into the machine gun nest, facing east, towards the drainage ditch where he assumed George had relocated. The man was now only 38 yards from George, his back exposed, unaware. A clear, easy shot. But George didn't fire. This sniper had survived 10 days of American operations. He hadn't lasted this long by being careless. Staying in that exposed rock position made no sense. It had to be bait. George stayed focused on the decoy, but widened his search. If this was a trap, the real threat would be covering the bait from a hidden angle. At 10:06, he found him. Another Japanese soldier, 70 yards northwest, lying behind a fallen tree, motionless, watching. His rifle was aimed towards the drainage ditch. 2 men working together, perhaps the last 2 snipers or one sniper with dedicated support. George considered his options. The Winchester was bolt action. He couldn't kill both before they reacted. After his first shot, they'd pinpoint his location instantly. He needed a different approach. He slowly slid deeper into the water until only his eyes and the top of his head remained above the surface, keeping the Winchester angled upward so the barrel wouldn't flood. And then He waited. At 10:13, the man in the rocks finally stood. After 10 minutes watching the ditch with no movement, he assumed George had fled farther east. He signaled to the second soldier. Both began moving east, sweeping the jungle 30 yards apart, searching methodically. George remained submerged and motionless as they passed his position. Now they were between him and the tree line, their backs completely exposed. George rose silently from the water, lifting the Winchester to his shoulder as droplets streamed from his uniform and the rifle stock. He aimed at the closer man, now only 42 yards away, and fired. The soldier collapsed instantly. George cycled the bolt, swung to the second sniper behind the fallen tree. The man was already turning, raising his rifle. But George fired first.
The second soldier collapsed. In 3 days, George had fired 11 shots and killed 11 Japanese snipers. He had cleared the Point Cruz groves of the marksmen who had taken 14 American lives in 72 hours. But as he climbed out of the crater to recover his spent casings, he froze. Voices, Japanese voices drifting from the tree line. Several men were moving toward the bodies. The snipers hadn't been working alone. George slipped back into the cold, muddy crater and submerged until only his eyes were above the water, holding his Winchester upright to keep the barrel dry. The voices grew louder, at least 6 men, maybe more, crunching through branches and undergrowth as they approached the fallen snipers. These weren't marksmen. They sounded like infantry, perhaps a patrol sent to retrieve the bodies. The voices reached the location of the first body, barely 40 yards from the crater, close enough that he could hear them clearly even without understanding the language. Then they moved to the second body. He listened to the urgency in their voices. At 10:28, the voices began moving again, this time toward him. They had found his tracks, footprints in the mud leading from the fallen tree to the crater. George had been careful about noise and movement, but he hadn't considered the trail he left. 5 rounds remained in the Winchester, at least 6 enemy soldiers. Terrible odds for a bolt-action rifle. The voices drew closer. 30 yards, 25, 20. Then a Japanese soldier suddenly appeared at the crater's rim, looking straight down at George. Their eyes met. George fired from the water, dropping the man instantly. Still submerged, he worked the bolt, rose enough to see 2 more soldiers at the rim, and shot both in rapid succession. 3 rounds left. Shouts erupted. More soldiers were converging. George scrambled out of the crater on the far side, sprinted 20 yards, and threw himself behind a fallen tree as rifle fire shredded the ground around him. They were firing at sound and movement, not precise targets. He peered through his scope. 2 soldiers were advancing on the crater, 50 yards away. George aimed, fired, and dropped the lead man. The second dove into cover. 2 rounds left. More voices behind him. The Japanese were flanking, one group closing from the south, another from the east. He was about to be surrounded. A bolt-action rifle was no match for multiple semi-automatic weapons. Staying meant dying. George grabbed his rifle and ran north. He crashed through vines that tangled his legs, branches whipping his face. Japanese fire snapped past him, kicking up dirt. After 90 seconds, he dived into another shell crater, this one dry, and pressed himself against the side. The voices were now distant. They had stopped chasing and were regrouping around their dead. George checked his rifle. Mud on the stock, water dripping from the barrel. Only 2 rounds left and no reloads. His stripper clips were still in his pack, somewhere near the first crater. At 10:47, he started moving again. Low, slow, using the jungle's contours for cover. He moved northeast toward American lines. The jungle around him was silent except for distant artillery. At 11:13, he reached the perimeter. A Marine sentry challenged him. George identified himself and was escorted inside.
At battalion headquarters, Captain Morris questioned him. George gave a full report. 11 snipers killed in 4 days, 12 shots, 11 hits. Then, the firefight with infantry, 3 more kills with 5 rounds. He was down to 2 bullets. Captain Morris asked about the rifle. George said it still worked, but needed serious cleaning. Mud in the action, water in the barrel. Morris ordered him to rest. No operations the next day. The battalion was shifting east, and the Point Cruz groves were no longer a priority. The Japanese were evacuating Guadalcanal and would likely be gone in 2 weeks. George returned to his tent. He stripped the Winchester and spent 2 hours cleaning every part, wiping away mud, oil, and cosmoline, running patches through the barrel until they came out clean. He checked the scope mounts, adjusted the eye relief, and loaded 5 fresh rounds. At 1400 hours, a messenger summoned him to division headquarters. George expected criticism for operating alone or using too much ammunition. Instead, he found Captain Morris, another officer, and Colonel Ferry, the regimental commander. Ferry had one question: could George train others to do what he had done? George said yes, if given time, rifles with optics, and men who already knew how to shoot. Ferry explained that division had recovered 14 Springfield rifles with Ernle's scopes, Marine sniper rifles. They also had 40 expert marksmen in the regiment. Ferry wanted George to build a sniper section, train the men, develop tactics, and clear any remaining Japanese snipers from the area. George agreed, but only if he could keep his Winchester. Ferry approved. On January 27th, George assembled 40 men at a makeshift range east of Henderson Field. All were qualified expert marksmen, though none had sniper combat experience. George began with fundamentals: breathing, trigger control, wind reading. The Springfield rifles weighed more than Garand's and more than his Winchester, but their weight provided stability. George taught the men to use whatever support the terrain offered: rocks, logs, sandbags. Training lasted 3 days. By January 30th, 32 men could reliably hit man-sized targets at 300 yards under field conditions. George organized them into 16 two-man teams, shooter and spotter. The spotter carried binoculars and a Garand, watched for threats, and rotated into the shooter role when needed to keep both proficient. On January 1st, George led 4 teams into the field. Their mission: clear Japanese positions west of the Matanaku River. At dawn, they set up along a trail used by retreating Japanese troops. At 7:20, a soldier appeared. George fired and killed him. Throughout the day, he and the other teams eliminated 23 Japanese soldiers, no American casualties. The new sniper section continued operating into early February. By the 9th, they had confirmed 74 enemy kills, only counting those whose bodies they could visually confirm. Meanwhile, the Japanese evacuation accelerated. Destroyers arrived nightly to extract troops from the island. American forces pushed west to cut off their retreat, and George's sniper section was tasked with eliminating Japanese rearguard troops covering the withdrawal routes.
On February 7th, while operating near the Tanambogo River, a Japanese rifleman shot George in the left shoulder. The impact spun him to the ground, but Hayes dragged him into cover and called for a corpsman. The wound was serious, but not life-threatening. The bullet had passed cleanly through muscle, without shattering bone or striking major blood vessels. George was evacuated to a field hospital near Henderson Field, where doctors cleaned and stitched the wound. He was told he would recover, but he needed rest, no combat for at least 3 weeks. He spent 2 weeks in the hospital, and during that time, the Japanese completed their evacuation of Guadalcanal. On February 9th, American forces reached Cape Esperance and found it abandoned. The campaign was over. George's newly formed sniper section had operated for only 12 days, but achieved 74 confirmed kills with 0 friendly casualties. Division headquarters formally recognized the unit's effectiveness, and Colonel Ferry recommended George for the Bronze Star. But his war was far from over.
While he recovered, orders arrived from Pacific Command. The Army needed experienced combat officers for a classified mission in Burma. George volunteered. In March, he boarded a transport ship heading west across the Pacific. His Winchester Model 70, sealed in a waterproof case, the Lyman Alaskan scope wrapped in oilcloth. He didn't yet know the details, only that the mission involved deep jungle warfare, long-range patrols, and operations behind enemy lines. Exactly the kind of fighting where a man capable of making hits at 600 yards might matter. The transport reached India on April 3rd. There, George and 200 other officers learned their assignment. They would join a new unit, 3,000 men with no official name yet. The men had already chosen one, Merrill's Marauders. The 5307th Composite Unit Provisional would be formally designated on May 28th, but training had already begun. The Marauders trained in long-range penetration tactics, jungle survival, and operating without supply lines, modeled after the British Chindits. George was assigned to the 2nd Battalion as a rifle platoon leader. The Army still had no official slots for snipers, but Colonel Ferry's recommendation had followed him. Commanders knew exactly what he could do with a precision rifle. Training in central India mirrored Guadalcanal. Heat, humidity, dense vegetation. Burma would be worse. Steeper terrain, heavier rain, and an enemy intimately familiar with the jungle. George modified his equipment accordingly. The Winchester had performed beautifully on Guadalcanal, but Burma would mean weeks-long patrols with every ounce of weight carried by hand or mule. He replaced the Lyman Alaskan scope with a lighter Weaver 330, which offered the same magnification at a lower weight, and swapped the wooden stock for a synthetic one. The rifle now weighed just under 9 pounds, a small but meaningful savings on patrols where every ounce counted. The Marauders entered Burma in February 1944. Their objective: advance through northern Burma and capture Myitkyina Airfield, a crucial link in the Allied supply route to China. Japanese forces held the area with roughly 4,000 troops. The Marauders would approach over terrain the Japanese considered impassable: mountains, rivers, jungle. No roads, only foot trails. Supplies would be carried on men's backs and by pack mules. No trucks, no artillery. Only rifles, mortars, and endurance. George's battalion began marching on February 24th. In the first week, they covered 83 miles through mountainous jungle. Men collapsed from exhaustion. Malaria cases surged. Mules broke legs on steep slopes and had to be shot. By March, they had marched more than 200 miles and fought 12 skirmishes, ambushes, brief firefights, and hit-and-run attacks. The Marauders were built for movement and disruption, not holding ground. George fired his Winchester 3 times during the march, at a Japanese officer across a river, at a distant machine gun crew, and at a sniper pinning down a patrol. 3 shots, 3 kills. He never fired twice in the same engagement. The Winchester's distinct report would give his position away. Shoot once, relocate immediately. The march to Myitkyina took 3 months. By late May, the Marauders had covered over 700 miles, losing far more men to disease than to combat: malaria, dysentery, typhus. The 5,300 men who had entered Burma were down to fewer than 3,000 effective soldiers. On May 17th, they captured Myitkyina Airfield. An operational triumph, but a human disaster. The unit was combat ineffective from exhaustion and illness. George survived the Burma campaign. His Winchester survived too, but he had fired it only 7 times in 3 months. The dense jungle rarely allowed long-range shots. Most engagements were ambushes at 50 yards or less. He realized something important. The Winchester Model 70 was an extraordinary rifle, one of the finest bolt actions ever made. But warfare was changing. The future belonged to semi-automatic rifles like the M1 Garand. By June 1944, George and the rest of the Marauders were evacuated and the unit was disbanded. He was reassigned to stateside training duties. He never fired his Winchester in combat again. George returned to the United States in July 1944. The Army promoted him to captain and sent him to Fort Benning to train infantry officers in marksmanship and small unit tactics. He taught the hard lessons of Guadalcanal and Burma, how to move through jungle, how to spot targets in dense vegetation, and how to operate alone or in pairs, far from supply lines. He kept his Winchester Model 70. It had traveled from Illinois to Tennessee, to Guadalcanal, to India, to Burma, and finally to Georgia. It had killed at least 14 enemy soldiers in confirmed engagements, likely more. George stopped counting after Burma.
The Winchester Model 70 stayed locked in a footlocker in George's quarters at Fort Benning. He rarely took it out. The war had shifted into a new phase. American forces were reclaiming island after island in the Pacific, pushing through France, entering Germany. The era of individual marksmen carrying privately purchased rifles was ending. The military was moving toward mass production, standardized weapons, uniform tactics. George understood why modern warfare depended on industry, but he also felt something important was disappearing: the belief that a single skilled rifleman with the right weapon could change a battle's outcome. George left the Army in January 1947 as a lieutenant colonel, decorated with 2 Bronze Stars, a Purple Heart, and the Combat Infantry Badge. He returned home to Illinois and enrolled at Princeton on the GI Bill, graduating with highest honors in 1950. He went on to spend 4 years studying at Oxford, followed by 4 years in British East Africa researching regional politics and institutions. He eventually settled in Washington, D.C., first as executive director of the Institute of African American Relations, then as a consultant and lecturer on African affairs for the State Department. During all those years, George almost never spoke of Guadalcanal or Burma. His colleagues knew he'd served in the Pacific, but they didn't know about Point Cruz, the 11 snipers he had hunted, or the Model 70 he kept quietly stored at home. In 1947, wanting to preserve the technical lessons of jungle warfare while his memory was still sharp, George began writing down his experiences. He worked for 6 months, producing a manuscript of more than 400 pages, dense with observations on weapons, ammunition, ballistics, and tactics. A friend at the National Rifle Association read it and urged him to publish. George hesitated. The manuscript was highly technical and hardly meant for a mainstream audience, but he eventually agreed. Later that year, Shots Fired in Anger was published. It became a classic among firearms historians and collectors, a precise, unembellished account of what actually worked in combat. George's descriptions of Japanese small arms remain some of the most detailed contemporary references available. George lived long enough to see America fight 3 more wars: Korea, Vietnam, and the Gulf War, and to watch military rifles evolve from the Garand to the M14 and eventually the M16. He saw sniping become a formal military discipline with specialized schools and equipment, and he watched new generations rediscover lessons he had learned in the jungles decades earlier. John George died on January 3, 1929, at the age of 90. His Winchester Model 70, the rifle that had outshot professional Japanese marksmen on Guadalcanal, was donated to the National Firearms Museum in Fairfax, Virginia. Today, it sits behind glass with a small placard. Most visitors walk past without noticing it. To them, it looks like any old hunting rifle. But it isn't. It's the rifle carried by a state champion marksman who proved that a mail-order sporting gun in the right hands could outperform trained military snipers. It's the rifle that cleared the Point Cruz groves in 4 days when an entire battalion couldn't do it in 2 weeks. the rifle that quietly shaped how the U.S. military viewed individual marksmanship. If this story meant something to you, consider giving it a like. Every click helps keep these forgotten stories alive. Subscribe if you want more accounts of real people and real courage. And drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and whether someone in your family served. Thank you for helping ensure John George's story is not forgotten.